Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get things rolling. This morning, I want to welcome everyone to our Campfire. We're going to be talking this morning about user interfaces, building web user interfaces. And although we're going to be showing a user interface built against an Evolution API, some of the principles we're going to go over apply in other cases. And in fact, the developer that's going to present this for us, Aaron Gulak, does front-end development for us against all kinds of different backends. And a lot of the same principles apply across all these backends that we develop in. So this is a little bit longer webinar. We're going to go just a little bit over an hour here to make it through all the material, but I think you guys will really enjoy this. It's pretty fast-paced, and we will be giving you some of the code that Aaron is developing here. We'll make it available to you so that you guys can play around with it a bit after the fact too. So without further ado, Aaron, why don't you get us going?
Yeah, thanks, Oliver. So, as Oliver said, we're going to be talking a little bit about APIs today, and we've talked a lot about APIs over the last couple campfires. We've talked a little bit about what they are. We talked about how to build them, and a little bit about how useful they can be when we're talking about web applications. So today we're going to be discussing that a little bit further. We're going to actually see how we can put an API to use on the web. So in order to do that, it requires a couple different pieces. First, we need a way to get the data from the API and a way to send data back to the API. So with JavaScript, the way that we do that is through HTTP requests. We can do gets, posts, deletes, things like that. And so then, of course, once we have this data, we need a way of taking that data and storing it to use within the web application. And that's done through JSON objects. Pretty simple there. We'll see those in use in a minute. Then after we have the data, we need a way to display the data to the user. The way that's done is through HTML and data binding, which we'll talk about in a minute as well. And that's just a visual representation of the data. Now that we have the data and we're displaying it to the user, we then need a way to allow the user to safely and easily manipulate that data. And that's done usually with JavaScript through a method called MVC, and that stands for Model View Controller. So we'll be talking about that as well here in a minute. So what we're going to do today is we're going to take all these pieces with an existing API, and we're going to essentially build a small web app, and you can kind of see all these things in action. Before we do that, though, let's go over a couple of terms that I'll be using throughout this demonstration. The first one is a single-page application. Now, to understand a single-page application, we need a little bit of background here and kind of the old way that websites were made. And how that was just with many static HTML pages. Each page that you wanted to go to was its own HTML page with its own resources and its own data. Now, this worked okay for informative websites when all we needed to do was just display information. You had your information on your page, you loaded a new page, and everything worked okay. The problem, of course, came when users wanted to be a lot more interactive with these websites, essentially turn them into applications. This process was very slow and cumbersome in that regard. So a new way was needed, and that's kind of the birth of a single-page application. What that is you have one parent HTML page that loads all your resources and kind of your base HTML, whether it's a menu bar or something like that. And then from that point, you have different what's called views that are dynamically loaded into a section of the HTML that you designate. So this works really nice with an application because you keep your base content. You don't have to load your resources every time you change a page. Just the information in this view is what changes. So this allowed for a lot more interactive web applications, and we'll see this in action here in a minute. The next thing is was mentioned before, the idea of MVC, and again that stands for Model View Controller. So once we had this single-page application, we needed a way to control the data, and this Model View Controller is a really good way of doing that. And the reason why is because a lot of times this data that you get from the server can be in all kinds of different formats, not necessarily in a format that the user can operate with. So this MVC kind of separates out the duties a little bit. So what the model is that's where the data is actually stored, and it's already parsed and it's ready to be sent to the server. Then we have the flip side of that, the view, and that's essentially the user interface, what's actually seen by the user. And the data at that point has been formatted into a readable format that the user can see and understand and even manipulate. So really what holds all of this together is the controller piece of this part. It's kind of the glue for this MVC. And what that is it contains all the business logic for your application, and it parses the data to be put in the model and then also formats the data for the view. So it kind of handles all of the grunt work, so to speak. And this idea of MVC...
when we talk about this, we're talking about MVC just in relation to the client side, correct?
Correct, yes. What I'll be referring today to is all on the client side. There are some servers that use MVC as well, but today we're just talking about the client. So this is all up until the point of sending the data to the server. Okay, so the next kind of term that we're going to be using today a lot is data binding, more specifically two-way data binding. And what that is that's essentially the magic behind the controller piece of MVC. What it does is it synchronizes the data between the model and view, and this is all done, if you have it set up properly, it's all done automatically. So at that point, the model, which is storing the data, kind of becomes this single source of truth, and then the view is just a constant projection of that model. So the data may be formatted differently, but it's all synchronized and it's all keeping both ends up to date properly. So this is a really cool piece of web applications today, and we'll see it in action here in a second with how we're going to implement it. It's kind of a really cool process. So now that we understand that, let's go to the next thing here. Okay, so with all these things like two-way data binding, MVC, single-page application, building a web application can seem very overwhelming and difficult. But the great thing is there's a ton of JavaScript frameworks out there that really make this process a lot easier than it would be. So what a JavaScript framework is, for those who don't know, is it's just essentially an environment that comes with various built-in tools and functionality just to make your process a little bit easier. And you can see there's 4 different frameworks here, but there's really a ton of frameworks out there, and they all operate differently. So when you're building your own web application, it's important to research these frameworks if you're going to use one and figure out which one is best for your situation. So there's some, for example, like Dojo, which offer a lot out of the box. They come with some built-in widgets that you can use, and there's a lot of things just ready to go right off the bat. With a framework like that, though, you may not have as much control, enough flexibility to do some custom things if that's required. Then the flip side of that would be something like Backbone.js. Backbone.js is very bare bones and very much left up to the developer to do a lot of the work. And that can be good for people who want a little bit more control. Maybe they're doing something a little more custom in this situation. So for our situation today, I'm going to be using Angular. And AngularJS is a framework that's maintained by Google. And I found that it is a really good balance of the two. That comes with a lot of things where you can get started pretty quickly, but also it gives you a lot of ability to do some custom stuff. So we'll see both sides of that a little bit with Angular. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and get started here. So go here. So we can see here I have a very simple web page here. And what this is kind of a base model of what a single page application will often look like. What this is just a free template that I found online. You can Google free HTML template, something like that, and that's what I did, and I found this. This is nothing done to it yet, just right out of the box. And this is a very popular look for a single page application. You can see we have our menu bar here on the left with some different options, to change the page, and then we have this content here in the middle. And what this would essentially be our view where we're going to dynamically load the content in there. So if we go and we look at the code, you can see here this is kind of that parent index page. You can see it has the menu there with just some information displayed. not a whole lot going on, and you can see here just a couple folders with some JavaScript that it comes built in with. So with this framework, this template that I got, it comes including jQuery and Bootstrap. jQuery is a set of tools and functions for JavaScript that can be pretty useful for manipulating HTML and things like that. And Bootstrap is just a purely CSS framework, which just comes with some built-in classes and such for styling your web application. So with this in mind, this is what we're going to start from. And you can see now, although this is ready to become a single-page application, it isn't yet. You can see we have the content just kind of hard-coded here into this this div, nothing dynamic going on. So what we're going to do now is we're going to turn it into a single-page application, a true one. So to do that, like I said, we're going to use Angular. So the first thing we need to do is just go and include Angular in our application. So to do that, you just go, Angular hosts their pages on the cloud, so you can go to their website and you can get the link to where they host their files. So we got to include them there. And then now at that point, we have Angular on our application. But of course, if we refresh the page, nothing really has happened yet because we haven't implemented it. So we'll go back in, and now what we're going to do is essentially bootstrap this HTML to be an Angular application. That's a term that they use. And to do that, we're going to just create a custom JavaScript file here, just where we're going to be doing some of our work. And it's real easy to turn this into a Angular application. Okay, so now we have our application, and we just go into the HTML and we use something built in with Angular called a directive, and this one is called ng-app, and we just tell it for this page we're going to use the order entry app. Okay, so now we have that, and now essentially our website is an Angular application. So if we refresh again, oh, I do need to include it here. So what these script tags are, if you don't know, is essentially just a way of including different files that you want to use. So we created that app.js file. So now we go and we refresh our page. Again, we still don't really have anything because we haven't done anything yet, but now we have an Angular application. So what we want to do now, like I said, is turn this into a single page application. And the way we're going to do that is by using a thing built in with Angular called a route provider. And what that is it's a service with Angular that just kind of helps you set up these routes. Okay. So before I go into this, let me explain it a little bit. The way that Angular does their single-page application is they set up a watch on the URL. So as the URL changes, they kind of trap that, and they look for a pattern that you have set up in your route provider, and they load in the content based on whatever that route is there. So we'll just set up a home page here real quick. And this is a pretty standard thing within Angular. And we'll just call it home, and we'll say to load home.html. Okay, so what this is essentially saying is it's saying when that section of the URL says home, to go load into the view home.html. So what we need to do now is create that file so that it has something to load into. So we'll create a views folder, and then inside of there, we'll create that HTML file called home. Okay, great. So now we have this home. We have our route set up. We'll set up a default real quick, just in case there's nothing that matches, and we'll redirect it to home. Okay. So let's give ourselves a link here to do that. Okay, so we'll come back in here, reload the page, and you can see if we click on home here, it takes you to home. Okay, let me see. Okay, seem to have an issue here. Yes. Okay, sorry about that. So this route provider is built in with Angular, but it is in a separate module called ng-route, so we just need to include that, and then we should be working fine. Okay, great. So we'll click on home, and we need to give ourselves that view. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to take this content here, and we're going to put it into home.html, so that when we load that view, it's going to load this HTML file instead. So now the last thing we need to do is just tell Angular where to load that content, because right now it has no idea. So that's done with another Angular directive called ngView. So we'll just put that right there. So now it knows anytime it loads this content based on the route, it's going to load it into this div. So now let's refresh and see what that looks like. Okay, great. So you can see up here it says /home, and it knows now when it says that in the URL to load that content that we told it into this section. So it looks the same now, but it's now loading in dynamically using this home.html. So now we essentially go ahead.
So you created this home.html file, and then you went into your JavaScript and set up basically a route so that Angular knows how to get to it.
Yep.
You created a link on the left that takes you to home if you click that link, and essentially, can you show again how the home.html ends up getting loaded into essentially, is this section on the right here, is that div, or how does it load it in dynamically there?
Yeah, so if we go back to our index page, you can see we still have most of the content, but now instead of that information we had, that's gone, and instead is this attribute in the element called ngView. And that's what Angular looks for. So it takes, in the HTML, it looks for that ngView, and then in the actual JavaScript code, it goes through this list of routes, and it finds the one that matches there, and it looks and it sees, okay, I want to load this HTML page, home.html in this case, and I want to load it into wherever that ngView is. So it just takes the content from that page and just inserts it right into that div.
Gotcha. Okay.
So we'll see that a little bit better as we set up some more routes, and you can see the content is actually going to change. But before we do that, I want to show a little bit of this data binding and kind of see how that works. So to do that, we're going to create what's called a controller. And what a controller is in Angular is essentially just a section of code that's assigned to a certain area of the HTML, and you can have access to all of its variables and functions within that section of the HTML. So we're going to call it home controller, and then now all we need to do is just tell Angular that whenever it's on that route with that HTML content, use this controller, home controller. So now as Angular loads in that view, it's also going to load in this controller with all of the functionality that we add to it. And this may look a little weird to you, but what this essentially is it's using something called dependency injection, and it's injecting this thing called scope. Now what scope is scope is essentially the model part of the web application in regards to Angular. What it does is it stores all the data in the format it needs to be in, ready to be sent to the server. And the HTML has access to this scope and can manipulate the data as it needs to be displayed on the view. So whatever section of HTML has access to this controller has access to the scope and can access it through data binding, which we'll see in a second. So what I'm going to do then is I'm going to create myself our first scope variable, and we'll just call it greeting message. And let's just say welcome to the order entry app. Okay. So now we have this variable within our controller on the scope called greeting message, and you can see it's just a simple string. So if we go into our home.html, we know we have access to that scope, and we can use it however we see fit. So what we're going to do, we're going to set up a data binding here. Instead of saying simple toolbar, let's show that greeting message. And the way that's done in Angular is with these double curly braces. You'll see this a lot. What that does is it just parses through the HTML, and wherever it sees these double curly braces, it assumes that's going to be a scope variable, and it just replaces the content there with that. So it's kind of cool. We'll set that up right here. Greeting message. So if we come in here and refresh the page, let's see what that looks like. So you can see now that header is set to welcome to the order entry app. And if we go into our content and we change whatever that variable is, then that message will change as well, and it will be updated. So that's kind of cool. But if we add another piece to here, we can really see how the magic kind of happens here. So we'll add an input text box, and we'll use another directive called ngModel, and we'll set it to that same variable. So what ngModel is you're essentially binding a variable in the model to this input text box. So it knows whatever the value is in the model, that's what needs to be displayed in this text box. So if we come in here and we refresh the page, we have this input text box here that says essentially the same thing, welcome to the order entry app, because they're both bound to the same thing. Now the cool thing is once we start changing this variable, you'll see what happens to that header. So let's add application here. Welcome to the order entry application. You can see it all changes in real time as you update the variable. So this is the kind of the magic behind the two-way data binding. It's constantly synchronizing the data. Okay, so now to see this even further, we're going to show kind of the controller piece of it, kind of if we wanted to add some business logic. This is a real simple idea, but we're going to use what Angular calls a filter. And what that does is it can take any data on the view and it can filter it as you see fit. There's some built-in filters with Angular. The one we'll use here is just called uppercase. You can guess maybe what that does. And but the really cool thing about Angular, why I like it, is it lets you do a lot of custom stuff too. So if you had some type of custom functionality you needed for the filter, you can always create your own filter and manipulate the data as you need to there. But we're just going to use one that's built in called uppercase. So if we refresh the page here, you can see the data in the input is still set to what it is in the model, but the header has now been kind of transformed to be all uppercase. So this is a simple example, but you can kind of see the power of that if you need to start handling data in different ways for different scenarios, maybe formatting a phone number or something like that. So that's a really cool piece of Angular that we're going to explore further here in a minute. But of course, just messing with strings to greet people isn't much use in a real life web application. So let's kind of give this some life. What we're going to do now is we're going to create just the customer side of an order entry application. And as Oliver said, we're using the Evolution API, and we're going to be using the order entry example. So you can see here, as a front-end developer, I'd be given something like this. This is a document that contains all of the calls in the API. And when we're talking about server-side calls, this is as deep as I'm going to need to go. I just see these calls, I see the information about them, how I access them, and I don't need to go any further into code at all. Whether it's a Dataflex application or a Rails application, it doesn't matter to me. As long as I have this document, I can do all the calls that I need. So the way that the Evolution order entry API works is it works with session management. So normally we would have a login screen where a user would enter a username and a password, and they would log in. They'd be given a valid session ID and go from there. We're not going to implement that today because of time, but we do need to get this session if we're going to do some other calls. So we see here we have the login call. We see what it needs. It needs a username and a password, and then it's going to return this session ID. So we'll just go in here to our code, and we'll create a function to get that session. So we'll go in here. Okay. So you can see here I created a function called getSession, and what it does essentially is it does an HTTP post, because if we go and we look at our API, it needs to be a post to this URL, so we can see we're doing that. We're passing it the method, and then we're passing it the username and password. In this case, it's just hard-coded for sake of time. And then down here we see this success, and what this is called a callback function in JavaScript. And the reason this is needed is because JavaScript is an asynchronous language. So what that means is it runs from top to bottom in your code and just calls one thing after another. It doesn't wait for a function to be resolved before it calls the next one. So that can pose some problems when we're expecting to have data that we might not have yet. So this idea of callback comes into play, and Angular does this really nicely and has a lot of that built in for you. So essentially what it says is go to the server and do this call, and then once it comes back successful, run this function, which in this case we're going to set that session ID to a global variable, and then we're going to let the user know, hey, that call was successful. So you may notice here I'm using this $HTTP. What that is that's another service built in with Angular, and that's what they use to access APIs to do server calls. So because it's a built-in service, we need to include it in our dependency injection. And I don't think I mentioned before with what dependency injection actually is. All it is with Angular uses dependency injection all the time, and what it is in JavaScript, what can happen is you can get a lot of global variables in your application, and that can really start to populate what we call the global namespace, and that can cause problems because you can get certain variables overridden, you can have some name conflicts, and it can just kind of get messy real quick. So Angular's solution to that is this idea of dependency injection. So you can take these services and you can inject them into your controller, and then at that point you have access to them. So it kind of creates an instance, so to speak, of that, whatever that variable is. So that's what we need here. We need this HTTP, so we'll save that. And now all we need is just a way to call this function. And as I said before, anything on the scope we have access to in the view. So we'll get rid of this input, and we'll give ourselves a button instead. We'll call it getSession. And what we're going to do is set up an Angular onClick event. And this that's through this directive called ngClick. And what that is exactly like a normal JavaScript onClick event, except for it treats whatever is in there as something on the scope. So you can access scope variables that way. So we're going to say onClick, call that function getSession. So if we come back here, reload the page, we can see we have our button here. Okay, great, the call is successful. So now we know we have that session ID. We can start making other calls and make this happen. So let's do that. Let's create another view. And like I said, we're going to be doing the customer side of it. So let's say we want a list of customers. We'll call it customers. And then the view we're going to load in, we'll just call customers as well. Pretty simple. And then the controller that we're going to use, let's call it customer list controller. Okay. So now we have a route set up in Angular. Let's go ahead and make sure we have these files. So we'll create another file called customers.html so that it has a page to load in there. And then we'll go into our code here and we'll give ourselves that controller, customer list controller. Okay, so now we have our controller, we have our view, we have our route set up. Let's give ourselves a way to access it. We'll go in here to our menu, and we'll just say /customers. Okay, so we'll reload the page. We're still on home, and you can see when we click here, click customers, it's going to change the view and take us to this. It's going to take us to this new page, which is now blank because we have no data in there. But you can kind of see now better how this single page application works. As we go to different pages, it loads in different content into that section. Okay, so now let's give some functionality. So now we know we need to do a call to get the list of customers. And how are we going to do that? Well, we can go back to our API here, find the call that we need. We see here we have a call get all customers. The parameters that it takes is just a session ID, which we know we have, and then it's going to return an array T customer. So we can scroll down here, and we can see T customer. We can see all the fields we're going to get in there, and we know what to expect. So let's use that information, and we'll implement this call here. So the way that I'm going to do it is I'm going to use this little nifty thing I have here that's called JSON RPC. Now that Evolution uses JSON RPC as its standard for accessing its API, and that's just, it's an HTTP call, but it's just set up a little differently. And you'll notice there's no $ here on this service that I have here called JSON RPC. Why that is because this is actually a custom service that I've created. I haven't created it yet, but I will in a minute. And that's another really cool thing about Angular is they have a lot of these built-in services that you can use, but they also have the ability to create your own custom one. So with JSON RPC, they require things in a very particular way. You need to pass a parameter called method. You need to pass an ID. And so because of that, that can get a little tedious to do on every single call. So let's create a service that kind of does a lot of that for us, kind of makes our lives a little easier. So we'll go in here and we'll add this service. You can kind of see what it looks like here. So I created, and I'm using a factory, which is just a kind of service that Angular provides, calling it JSON RPC. And what I'm essentially doing is just returning a usable function that we can use. So you can see it takes in a method and the parameters that you want to pass to it. And then the rest is essentially handled within here. So I have my URL. I'm adding my session ID onto my list of parameters since every call is going to need a session ID. And then I'm just doing the same HTTP post with the method, the parameters, and then an ID. And so this makes your life really easy.
You could have done this call. You could have done this call the same way you did the other one. This one is basically just saving you a little bit of typing and making it so the URL is all in one place. But this is something very specific to this service, correct, or to this API that we're building, right?
Exactly that. You could do every single call in here using just the Angular HTTP. But yeah, for our situation, we're using JSON RPC. That's a little bit of a unique situation. So for this application, we created a service to set that up. And so this way, it's good because it makes for cleaner code, but also, let's say you're using a development URL and you want to go live, you just have to go here into one place and change the URL. Let's say you're not using session management anymore, you're using something else, you can go in and change that. So it kind of keeps a lot of the details in one place, makes it a lot easier if you need to change something. Okay, so now that we have that service and we're injecting it into our controller, now we have access to it. So let's go ahead and get some customers here. So we'll call that, and remember it's a function, and it takes the method first, which we saw from our API is get all customers. And then the parameters that it takes for this one, all it takes is a session ID. Now that may seem a little weird, and it kind of is. Normally, when we're building an application, we would have some type of paging implemented, or maybe an infinite scroll where we would do an offset. But for this situation, for the sake of the demo, we have a call that just gets all the customers in one thing. So all we need is the session ID, which we know our service automatically adds that on for us, so we don't even need to add that. So it's just as simple as that, and then we'll set up our callback function. And we know that it's going to return that list of customers, so we'll just call that customers. And then at this point, we want to create a variable in our model that holds the customers. So we'll create a scope variable called customers, and we'll set it to whatever we get back from that call. Okay, so now when this controller loads, it's going to go through and it's going to do that call. When it finishes, it's going to set whatever it gets back to that customer's variable. So if we go in here, now we have access to that variable in our view. So let's set up some data binding, and let's see what this looks like. So we'll come in here and we'll refresh the page. you can see, okay, we have a giant wall of text. But if you look, this is just an array of all the customers like we would expect with all of their information. So we see just that easily, we did a call to the server, got a list of all the customers, and now we have access to it on our view. Now, of course, nobody really wants to look at this for longer than 10 seconds, and doesn't really do any good for anybody involved. So let's go ahead and make it a little easier to look at. And the great thing about using this system is now at this point we have the data, we have access to it in the view. Now we're essentially just building an HTML page. So all that takes is just some simple HTML development, and I have some code here. Okay, so you can see what I did here. I just added a nice little header, and then I just created a simple HTML table. This is just a standard table, nothing special about it. We have our header set up for some columns that I'm going to show. We have our body, and then we have a row here with some data binding set up. Now this is the part that you may not understand, and what that is it's another directive built in with Angular called ng-repeat. And this is one of the most commonly used directives in Angular because it's really actually very powerful. What it does is it iterates over a variable in the scope. So in this case, it's looping through the list of customers. And what it does is whatever element that's on and any elements within it are going to be created for every item in that array. So for every customer in this list of customers, it's going to create a row here with these columns, and then we have the data binding set up to display that information. So it's really cool. Instead of putting all these rows in manually, you just set up this ng-repeat, and as that array grows or shrinks, it just automatically updates in the view. So now that we have that table, let's take a look and see what this looks like here. Okay, great. So look, we have our header here, and we have a nice table with some with all of our data essentially, a little bit more organized, a little bit easier to read. So not too bad, but that still looks pretty hideous. Not a great web application so far. So let's give this a little bit of a flair. Now that we have the data and now that we have it being displayed in HTML, now it's just a simple matter of adding some CSS, which not even that much CSS, but I have another block of code here, and you can see if I put that in, I really didn't change a whole lot here. I just added some simple CSS classes with some styling, and we'll take a look at what this looks like. A lot of these classes are Bootstrap classes, so I didn't even have to write any of the CSS myself because this template came included with Bootstrap. You can go onto their website, see what these classes do. It's really pretty simple, but I did add a little bit of custom CSS, so I have that file already. I just need to include that. I called it custom.css. Okay. So now I have my custom CSS. I have my table with some of the classes. Let's go back to our page and let's see what that looks like. Okay, so you can see now, just a matter of minutes, I got my list of customers, and now I have a nice looking table that's organized, that's spaced out properly. We have some hoverability here so you can see which one you're on. It's centered on the page. A pretty decent looking list of customers. And so at this point, this is a pretty basic styling.
Aaron, is all of this, because it's Bootstrap, it's all going to be responsive too, right?
It is going to be responsive, yeah. Yeah, and I'm going to actually show this on a mobile device here closer towards the end, but we can see that because it's using Bootstrap, it's all responsive and it all shrinks down to iPad, even to mobile phone size. So we'll see that in a minute, but pretty cool, yeah. Okay, so now we have our home page here. We have our list of customers that shows all of our customers. Let's say we want to go in and view a specific customer. Well, a good way to do that would be clicking on here and then going in and viewing the customer. So that's easy to do as well. What we're going to do, we'll set up another route in our route provider, and we'll just call this one just customer. And then we'll say to load, we'll just call this one customer.html. Keep it simple. And we'll call it customer control. Okay, so now we have that. Let's make sure we create those files. HTML, and then we'll create our controller for that. Okay. Alrighty. And then we want to have access to the customer number when they click on this. So another thing in this route provider is you can add parameters to the URL. And the way you do that is you just add a colon, and then you call it customer number. And so when it goes through this route, it's going to expect a parameter here, and it's going to set its value to a variable called customer number. So that's just a way of passing like an ID or something to the route in case you need it to access some information. Get rid of this little guy. Okay. So now we have a route set up for customer that's passing it the customer number. We have our controller, and we have our view HTML page. Now let's give ourselves a way to get there. We said we wanted it to happen when they clicked on the row. So we set up an ng-click here on the row, and we're going to call a function called view customer, and we're going to pass it in whatever the customer is on that row. So now that we have that, we'll go back into our customer list controller and add that function. View customer. And we know that's a function that takes in that customer object. Okay, so the way we're going to do that is we're going to use another built-in service with Angular. You can see I pass it in here. It's called location. And what that does is it lets you manually change that section of the URL within your code. So we're going to set it to customer, and then we're going to pass it the customer number that was clicked on. So it's just customer.customer number. So now that we have our function and we set up our on-click event, let's refresh the page, click on it, and you can see here the URL changes to customer/1 because that's the customer number of that customer, and now we're on a new page. Of course, we don't have any data yet, but we can definitely change that. So what we could do here now is in our controller, we could do a call that would find the customer based on that customer number and then display the information. And that's not a bad way of doing it, but let me show you why that's not the best way of doing it. If we go back to our list of customers, you can see when the page loads, some of the HTML loads first, and then it kind of flashes and all of the data shows. That's because the HTML loads, and then once the server comes back with the call, then it loads the data. Well, that's okay, but it looks a little choppy, and it's not really the best user experience. So what we want to do now is we want to have the data before we load the controller, before we load the view. And that's possible with Angular pretty easily using what they call a resolve. So in our route, we'll come in here and we'll set up a resolve. And you can have as many of these as you want for your page. We'll just need the one called customer. And we'll inject some things in here that we'll need. Another built-in service, and then our JSON RPC. And okay. So now what we want to do here is we want to get that customer number from the URL, and that's used with that route service that I just injected. So we'll get that variable. And you can see how to do that pretty easily in Angular's documentation. Okay, so you can see I just got this variable. I'm getting the customer number from the route, setting it to the variable. Now we can do our call. And what we want to do is we want to find the customer associated with that number. So how are we going to do that? Well, let's go back to our trusty documentation here. And let's see, we have this call. Okay, method find customer. That looks like what we need. We need to pass it the session ID, the customer number, which we have, and then this thing called find direction. Okay, well, I have no idea what that is. Let's see if I get any more information here. Description takes a valid session, find direction. To find the customer number equal to the one passed, use 2 as the find direction. Okay, well that's what I want, so I know I need to pass 2 in for that variable. So now we can set up our call as we need to. And because our JSON RPC function uses a callback, all we need to do is just return that function. So The method is find customer, and then we pass some parameters to it. We don't need to pass session ID because we automatically add that, but we do need customer number, which we have here as number, and then we need find direction, and we know that needs to be 2. Okay, so we can see here all we're doing is we're returning that function to find a customer. So whatever the result of that function is going to be returned into this customer variable, and it's going to be resolved before the view loads and before the controller loads. So now we know once this controller loads, we have that variable customer. So at that point, it can be treated like any other service, and we can just essentially inject it into our controller like so. Okay, so we know we have that. Let's put it into the model by making a scope variable. Okay, great. So now we know we have a scope variable called customer, and it's going to be set to whatever that function returns. So let's go into our view here, and let's see what that looks like. Okay, refresh our page. Let's click here. Okay, great. So it went and it did that call based on the customer number and returned that data. So now we have the customer object in our scope, and we can now access it in the view. Of course, this doesn't do anyone much good to just view the customer. A lot of times with this, you want to edit the customer, maybe change their name or their address or something. So let's see how we can implement that. So I have some code set up here. Just take that. Okay, so what I did here, I had another header, and then I just have a simple HTML form with some different inputs for some data that we want to be able to change: name, city, state, phone number, and email address. And what I'm doing here is you can see in the inputs, I have that directive again, the ng model, which we saw on the home page there, and it's just set to that customer object and the name value in that customer object. So each one's set up with its proper values, and so whatever the variable is set to in the model should be displayed here on the view in the input. So let's see how that works. We'll refresh the page. Great, we have our customer header. We have these inputs now with all of the different information. Now we can start editing this as we need to. Of course, same problem we had before. It looks pretty terrible. But now that we have it in the HTML with the data we need, now it just becomes a matter of some CSS. So all that is just add some classes. So we'll replace that with this. And you can see all I did, I just added some more simple bootstrap classes, and we'll see what that does to it. So refresh the page. Voila, we have this nice form. Everything's evenly spaced. You can read things. We have a little bit of highlighting for whatever one is focused. Okay, this is more of a usable thing here that we can have. So let's give the user the ability now to update this customer. So in order to do that,
Okay, Aaron.
Yeah.
Before you do that, so the difference between what we did on the page where we list the customers and on this one, on the page where we listed all the customers, the controller basically loaded, and then after that, by loading the controller, it loaded the HTML, and then after that, it loaded the data into it. Whereas on the second one, we did it kind of backwards of that, right?
Correct, yeah. So you can see here in this customer list controller, once the controller loads, the view loads, and then it does this call to get all the customers. So it loads the view, then does the call. What we did on the other one was we have this resolve, and so what we say is before you load the view, before you load the controller, do this call first. Once that's done, then you can load everything. So it kind of nicely makes it so that, once the HTML loads, you already have the data. You can see there is no second flash there at all.
Gotcha.
Okay, so we know now we need the ability to update this customer. So let's go back to our API and see what it's going to take for that. We have this call add edit customer. Takes another session ID and then takes a customer object, which we know we have. We see there's some required fields here. Okay, well, all I need right now is just what to pass to it, so that's enough information for me. Let's create a function. So we'll go in, this. Okay. All right, so what I did is I created a function called save, and all it's doing is just our JSON RPC call. The method is add_edit_customer, and I'm passing it that customer object, the scope variable scope.customer. Then I have my callback, and what I'm doing here is I see that in the API it returns an object tCustomer as well. So that's a common thing that we're going to see when we're saving data. Is it's going to, with an API, is it returns back that customer object. And the reason that is a lot of times on the server they may have some business rules in place where some different fields get updated automatically that we don't have access to or that we don't know about. So it's a lot of times good to get that customer object back and then set it again to our scope variable so that we know we have the most up-to-date version of that customer. So that's what we're going to do, and then we're going to let the user know, hey, good job, that save was successful. So if we go back into our form, what we could do here is we could add a button with an on-click event. But we're not going to do that because we're dealing with a form. And the old way of dealing with forms is you would submit the form, all of the inputs on there would be automatically submitted to whatever URL you put. Well, that's an old way of doing it. It requires you to refresh the page. You can lose a lot of your data. Not really the best way to do it when we're talking about a single page application. So what Angular does is it gives you this directive called ng-submit. And that just kind of overrides the traditional form submit. And instead of doing that, it's going to call whatever function you tell it to in the directive. So we're going to say on submit, call this save function, which we just wrote. So now we just need to add a button that will be our submit button. So that's pretty easy to do too. All right, button. Okay, we'll call it save. And instead of adding that on-click event, all we need to do is just tell it that the type is a submit. So whenever it's clicked, it's going to submit that form. So we'll refresh the page. You can see typo. All right, perfect. So now we have our save button. We know that's going to submit the form, which is going to then do that save call to add/edit this customer. So let's change the data and see what happens. Let's say this place isn't going to be a center anymore. Call save. Save was successful. Great. So by all accounts, we just updated this data. So let's go back to our list of customers. And if we go to Ortega Emergency Care, you can see now it's no longer center. It just says Ortega Emergency Care. So we actually went and we updated this data on the server. Now on the server, it's changed as it was. So we can add back center. We can change this to Houston. Save that. And you can see here in the list of customers, Ortega Center, Houston. So just that easily, we're updating this data, and yeah, we're good to go there. So now we have our list of customers. We have the ability to view a customer and to update a customer. Let's say we want to create a new customer. Well, that's pretty easy to do as well. We already have this button here for a new customer. So let's set up our route. Well, if you notice, this JSON RPC call is add or edit a customer. So what this API provides is one call to edit a customer and to add a new one. So we really don't need to get a new call. Thus, we don't need to get a new controller. And in reality, the view doesn't change all that much because it's the same data that we're changing, so we can keep the same view. But we do need to tweak something a little bit. So we'll go into our route, and we'll see here this parameter, customer number. Well, if it's a new customer, they're not going to have a customer number. So what we'll do is we'll make that parameter optional, and then we'll go into our resolve. And of course, if there's not a number, we don't want to do this call. So what we'll do is we'll just set up a check for that. We'll say if there is a number, then do this call, and then if there isn't, just return an empty string. Okay, so it's going to go into this resolve. It's going to look for that number. If it is there, it's going to find the customer. If not, we're just returning an empty string. So when we come in here, we'll know, okay, it's an empty string, it's a new customer, let's do something different. So we don't really, an empty string for a customer is not much good to us. So let's do something a little different. Okay, so what we're doing here is we're saying if that customer is there, set it to the scope variable, and if it isn't, let's create just a new object with some defaults. And I get those defaults from my API here. You can see there's some required fields: email, name, state, phone number. We're all going to enter in, and then status needs to be either yes or no. So we'll just hard code that in there. So now when this controller gets created and it sees that it's a new customer, it's going to create some defaults for us here. So let's give ourselves a way to access it, which we already have up here with our button, new customer, and we can see it takes us to /customer without the customer number. So if we refresh the page, click on new customer, we can see, okay, we're here, we have a blank form, we're ready to go to create a new customer. Now, one of the cool things with Angular is this idea of being able to handle things on either side. And what I mean by that is we have our default object here, and the only values in there are customer number and status. But on the form, we have all of these other ones. We have name, city, state, and the cool thing is you could set up those values in the controller on the model side, or you can set them up on the view. And so as this changes, it will automatically get inserted into that customer object as customer.name. So that was easy enough. Let's see how this works. So we'll create a new customer called Tony. And Tony lives in Fresno, California. Give him a phone number. And let's say he was early on the Gmail bandwagon and got one of the cool emails. Okay, so now we're ready to go. Let's save him and see what happens. Save successful. Okay. I don't know if I believe that. Let's see. Scroll down here. Look at that. Tony from Fresno with the phone number tony@gmail.com. So just like that, we created a brand new customer without changing too much code, just making that parameter optional. So now he's treated as a new customer, but we could go in, create another one if we wanted to. So that was relatively simple and painless, but I don't know if you noticed here, we have this input text box for state. Now, a problem with this sometimes can be we give the user a little bit too much control. If there's a field here called state, they can really put in whatever they want right now. They can put in CA, they can put in California, they can put in Timbuktu for all we know. Well, we know that on the server side, they're expecting it to be a two-letter abbreviation like this. So we don't really want them to put anything in there. We want to really limit what they can do. So that's easy in HTML. All you need to do is make a select box. So we'll change this input to be a select instead. And what a select is just a simple combo form. Don't need this anymore. Okay. And the way that works with HTML is you would set up these options here. You set the value to CA and then tell it to display California. We'll just add another one so we can see it working. So Texas. Okay, so if we go in here, refresh the page, you can see now we have this drop down. It says California now, and we have our options here. We can change it to Texas, change it back to California. So that's nice. Now the user is limited on what they can choose. They can't just put in anything there. But so we could go in here and we could add an option for every single state in the United States, all 50, and put them right in here, hard-coded in our HTML. And that could work in certain scenarios, but a lot of times that's not gonna be very useful. For example, let's say we're a multinational company and different countries have different states. That's not always going to work to just put the United States. So let's get rid of this, and we'll use something that Angular has built in. And what they use is they use a thing called ng options, and that is similar to ng repeat. It's just treated for a select box. So we're going to say state.code. This will make more sense in a second as state.description. State and states. So what this is going to do is this is going to iterate over this scope variable states. So for every item in that states object, it's going to create an option for that, and it's going to store it as state.code, but it's going to display it as state.description. So that gives you the ability to add labels to it, so it's a little bit more readable. So if we save that, and then go look at that. Obviously now it's empty. That's because we don't have a scope variable called states yet. So we'll go into our app.js, our customer controller, and we could just create a scope variable here called states, and we could hard code it in here, but that's really going to give us the same problem as putting it into the HTML. So what we'll do, we'll go back to our API, and we'll see here we have this call get codes, and it takes the session ID and then the type, and what it does is it retrieves items from the code mass table, and it returns it as code.description, and you can pass something like states. Well, that's what we need. We need that call, so we can implement that in pretty easily. So we'll create a function, and we'll call it get states. And what that does, it does our JSON RPC call for get codes. The type it is states, and then when it comes back, we set what we get back to a variable in the model called states. So that's pretty easy. Now we just need to call it. Okay, so the controller is going to load. It's going to call that get states call and set that variable. So let's see what happens. Okay, great. So we'll look at this, and you can see we now have all the states that we need all ready to go. You can change it as you want, and it all just works like that. And so just to kind of emphasize the difference between the view and the model, if we look here, we'll just set this up and we'll say customer.state, just so we can see what this looks like. So you can see on the model, it's being stored as CA, but on the view, it's being displayed as California. So as you change that, Georgia is what's being displayed, but it's being stored as GA. So that's kind of the magic behind the two-way data binding with the controller, is it automatically parses the data for the server into MD and then formats it for us on the view as Maryland. So just kind of nice to see that in action. Okay. So now you can see we have a pretty decent web app coming along here. We have our home page displaying some information. We have our list of customers. We can create a new customer. We can add an existing customer. So now we can start worrying about the user experience a little bit more. So, for example, this drop down here, it's just a typical HTML select with some options. It works okay, not too big of a deal. But let's say that the user doesn't want to scroll through a big list of states, or maybe they're selecting a country and there's way too many. It can be a little annoying to have to search through a big long list. So it'd be great if we could add maybe a filter box to this select, so they can find the state that they want a little bit easier. Well, when we're using a web app this way with an API, keeping everything separate, that becomes really easy. We can just use a plugin out there. So I know jQuery has a lot of nice plugins, so we'll say jQuery drop-down plugin. Let's see what comes up here. So there's a couple different ones here we could look at. For the sake of time, I already happen to know this one here. This is a chosen drop-down, and it says it turns a select into something like this. Well, this has our nice filter box. Okay, yeah, this looks like exactly what I need. Okay, so we would download this file, which I have already done, and then we can begin to implement it. And the way that Angular works, it's not always going to be this way, but a lot of times with plugins like this, you create a wrapper for Angular so that it works more in the Angular environment a little easier. So sometimes that's not out there, but in this situation, someone has already written that wrapper for us. So let's find one there. We see this is it takes the jQuery plugin chosen, and it kind of makes it work with Angular by creating a directive to do all of the work for us. So okay, this is what we need to do.
Is this unusual that I mean, yeah, you picked one here, but I mean, you kind of knew this one, but how often are you going to be able to find for Angular for any given control a plugin? I mean, is that fairly common?
It is fairly common. In fact, mostly everything that we've used, there's been an Angular plugin or wrapper for a different plugin already out there. So it really saves you a lot of time. But Also, if it's not, I have written a custom one before, and they're really not that intimidating at all. They're pretty simple to do. So, but yeah, there are a ton of them already out there.
Okay.
Okay. So I went ahead and I downloaded these files. I already included them in the folder for the sake of time. So we just need to include them on our index. So we'll go in here. You can see I am including the jQuery plugin, and then I'm also including the Angular wrapper for it. So they're two separate files. And then with this plugin, they include some CSS to style it a little bit for us. So I'll include their CSS file as well. And so now we're good to go, maybe? Well, let's go look at the documentation. We can see to use, include this string as a dependency in your Angular module. Okay. What that means here is, if you remember, we included this ng route in our Angular application. And what that is, that's just a module built in with Angular that you want to include. So whenever you start creating custom ones or you download one as a plugin, you would usually include it here as another module in your app. So we'll just include that as it says we need to. And now we have access to that plugin. So let's look and see what else is needed. Usage, okay, simple example. They have their select box with their options. Looks like all you need to do is just add this little attribute in the HTML called chosen. Well, that's easy, we can do that. So we'll come in here to the select box, and we'll just add that chosen there. Let's see what happens. Refresh the page. Okay, yeah, that looks a little different now. Drop it down. Now we have our plugin built in. We can search for California, change it just like that, and it works just the way it did before, just better. Looks a lot nicer. We have our search box. So again, relatively easy. We went out and we found a plugin that worked for our situation. We downloaded it. We read the documentation, what was required, and in a matter of minutes, we had it implemented and working with our application. So that's a really simple example, but the idea there is just doing things this way. You have access to whatever the internet has to offer, all of the plugins and everything you can implement like this relatively easily. Okay, so for our customer order entry application here, we're pretty close to done, but let's just add some final polishing things to it. So we'll go in here, we'll get rid of maybe these extra items in the menu that we're not using. Let's change this to order entry, and we'll default that to home. And then I did notice with this template here that it has this functionality to toggle the menu if they wanted to hide it. So we can do that. We can put that in here pretty simply, but we need a button for that. So we'll go down here, add a button, and we'll just put it right above where our view is. Let's see what that does. Okay, so you can see now we added a little button that can close and open that, which is nice if you need a little bit more room for things. Okay, so now let's go ahead and let's view this from a responsive point of view. See if we need any work from that regard. So let's see what this looks like on iPad. Okay, still looks pretty.
What is that whole toolbar across the top that you just used to do that, Aaron?
This is built in with Chrome, at least on Mac, and it's just part of their developer tools. They can emulate different devices for you, and it's pretty cool. You can see there's a little circle here. They treat it as touch events when you use it, and you have access to all of these different devices. So it really helps with responsive design. You can even do some network throttling, treat it like it's going over 3G or Wi-Fi, things like that, and it just kind of gives you an idea of what your app's going to look like in different environments. So this isn't what an iPad would look like. We see that still looks pretty good. We go in here. You can see kind of the cool thing about Bootstrap, as Oliver mentioned earlier, is it's responsive. So you can see when we were bigger, things were spread out. As we get smaller, refresh. As we get smaller, you can see it kind of drops down in just a single column view, and it's a lot easier to use on your iPad. So now the big question is, what does it look like on an iPhone? Let's refresh the page here. We can see it's very much the single column view. This template has it set up to hide that menu for us on mobile to give us a little more room. So good thing we added this. We want to go back home. We have our, still works the same, but let's look at our list here. So you can see our table now looks completely different. And what we did there is I went in, and this is custom CSS, but nothing too crazy, and I just added about 40 lines of code here for our table. And what that does is it essentially stacks the table on mobile. So if this weren't stacked like this, the table could look really squished. It could be hard to read the information, not really a good user experience. So the way we have it here is it's much more readable. So as we go out, you can see it changes back to the old table. As we get small, it stacks those items. So they're still treated the same. They can still be clicked on, but it's just a lot more mobile friendly. So that's pretty much it. There is one thing I've noticed that's a little annoying. When you click on here, it doesn't close the menu for you. So let's just go in and fix that real quick. And that can be done in a lot of different ways. I'm just going to use jQuery and set up a on-click event for those items in the menu. So essentially, for all those items in the menu, if the Windows, if you're on a mobile device, then we're going to toggle that same class so that it hides the menu again. So let's refresh, go to customers. Okay, now we're dealing with a nice web application, very easy to use on all devices. If we go back up to iPad, still easy to use. Everything's nicely formatted. So that's really all we're going to go over today. You can see in a matter of a little over an hour, we started with just a free Bootstrap template with not much functionality. We turned it into a single page application, bootstrapped it with Angular, set up some calls accessing our API, and we have a very functional web app now. And not a whole lot of time with not a whole lot of effort either. So yeah, Oliver, that's pretty much all I got.
That's pretty impressive, Aaron.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, well, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
So the idea here of being able to take an API, no matter how it was developed, and spit something out in such a short period of time is kind of one of the ideas we wanted to really show here. Aaron doesn't really have any knowledge of the Dataflex code running behind this, which this is Dataflex in this case. And really from the standpoint of the separation of duties, which is something we've talked about before, it doesn't matter. He knows that it's a JSON RPC call. He's got some documentation to work from. And as a front-end developer, he can build something against it just using that. And this really allows for a different type of programmer to build a front end like this, and you can see how quickly someone who has the knowledge of doing a JavaScript front end can do this. And of course, Aaron is not a designer either. So normally, what would you do with this, Aaron? At this point where you've got something like this running?
Yeah, well, as Oliver said, I'm definitely not a designer. So at this point, if we wanted to add a little more flair to it, we just pass it off to our designer, and he doesn't need to know any JavaScript or definitely any server-side stuff. He just does his CSS and HTML work and makes it look even better than this.
Yeah, so this concept of being able to separate the duties right off the bat, as you can see, one of the other advantages that we have in this scenario is that API could be used from somewhere else just as easily. He consumed it in a web environment in this case, but just as easily this could have been consumed by an iPhone application, for instance, or by another Windows application or something like that. This sort of API development really allows you to do some amazing stuff with this concept of separation of duties. And Riaz, were you going to mention something? Well, I want to open it up to questions. If anyone has any questions, I know Aaron kind of flew through some of this stuff. We had quite a bit of material to get through. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask. while while we give them a little opportunity to think about that, I've got a couple of questions, Aaron.
Okay.
So if you go back into the code where you did your where you actually do the form submit.
Yeah. The HTML code?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, right here.
So in there, you mentioned that you're passing a form of data, and I know everywhere else you were passing around this customer object that was on the scope, but in this case, what you're passing into the into the save function is the form itself. How is that different? Why don't you pass the customer in there? Why pass the form?
Yeah, that's actually the way that Angular deals with forms is they automatically for you create a scope variable of the form based on the name you put here. So there's now going to be a scope variable called form for us. And what that does is it just gives you kind of information on the form. So it'll tell you the different items that are in the form. It'll tell you their state, whether they've been touched on the input text box yet or whether they're in what's called a pristine condition. Excuse me. They'll tell you whether they're in a valid state, so you can add some HTML validation to say that it's required, and it'll tell you it's in an invalid state because it's required and it's empty. So it gives you a lot of information on the form, and you can then set up some client-side validation, which I didn't have time to do today, but relatively simple with that form. You can make sure it's in a valid state before it gets submitted.
Okay. And another question, when it comes to these plugins, I mean, this chosen one worked very easily. It was super simple in this case. I'd imagine, because a lot of these are free and out on the internet, you see lots of, variation in quality and things like that. Are there any places or specific things you look for, to kind of suss out whether you found a good plugin or how do you go about that process?
Yeah, well, a little bit of that is trial and error. I had to deal with a couple bad ones before I found Chosen that worked pretty well, but there are some things that can help you. For example, when you go onto their GitHub page, you can see a lot of times how long it's been since they've updated their code. And his source files he edited just 2 months ago. So this is a relatively kept up plugin. If you see, everything here is over a year, and there's not a lot of documentation, that's also sometimes a giveaway that it might not be as reliable as something else might be. So that's a good way to know. But some of it is just trial and error. There is a website called UI Bootstrap, which takes a lot of plugins that Bootstrap has, and it turns them into to work with Angular. So this includes a lot of different directives you can have. As you can see, there's a lot here. There's tabs and tooltips and modals and things like that. So I know at this point that this is a reliable website, so kind of anything they make I know is usually going to be pretty good. So a little bit of trial and error and a little bit of just kind of getting an idea of how often they maintain their code.
Gotcha. And we do have a question here from Richard Miller. He asks, how much faster is Dojo development than Angular with it having some of the pre-built capabilities? Why don't we take that piece first? What do you think about that?
Well, I have actually I've developed a little bit in Dojo, and I actually find Angular to be a little quicker in development. It doesn't have these it doesn't have a lot of those built-in widgets, but getting yourself started and getting to a usable place is pretty quick with Angular. You download their stuff, you bootstrap the application like I showed you, and you're ready to start working with the data. In terms of the part that does take a little bit longer is the actual styling, because that's treated as separate, that's treated as CSS, and that needs to be handled differently. With Dojo, they build a lot of the HTML for you, so that part can be quicker, but I found the time you save with getting the data how you need it and formatting it and stuff to well make up for the disadvantage there.
Gotcha. We also have a question, how many different JavaScript platforms does a quality JavaScript programmer know? Well, it's always good if they know one that you need. But certainly a lot of the concepts carry over. When you get into some of the outliers in JavaScript frameworks, you're going to see some things that are done pretty much in a very unique manner to that framework. You'll see some outliers that are very unique in the way they handle certain things. Some of them have even essentially created their own language. But in general, a lot of the frameworks have similar qualities, and they focus on specific areas. So Dojo focuses on the user interface controls. Angular really, I think, Aaron, you'd agree, Angular focuses on providing a very rich MVC architecture. You know, is kind of their focus, and so that's why that's one we've chosen. But certainly getting up to speed on a new framework does take some amount of time. You know, we like to make sure we train people on a few different ones, though, just so they have a broad worldview that way.
Yeah, and like you said, all the frameworks are JavaScript frameworks, so they may have their own syntax to a certain extent, but it's all JavaScript, and so if you're a JavaScript programmer, you can get familiar with the framework relatively quickly.
Yeah. So, you know, as for what's coming up next from the standpoint of webinars, certainly we're going to release the code that Aaron developed here, and there are a lot of pieces that are still not in here, and so certainly in a follow-up we're going to kind of expand on this. I don't know if it'll be a Campfire or just a YouTube video, but you know, there's things like getting rid of those alert pop-ups that Aaron showed for the save successful messages using a proper messaging system, and some stuff related to error handling that you can add in here that we just didn't have the time to go through, and you know, in such a short time frame. But certainly we're going to show you how to do some of those things with this front-end development environment as well. And so that's about it. You know, thank you guys for joining us today. We'll stay on for another minute here if you have any questions. Otherwise, thank you for joining us. Thank you, Aaron.
Yeah, no problem.
One other question here. This webinar was recorded, so you'll be able to, we'll have it posted. Normally they're posted by the end of the day for us, so we'll have it posted very shortly, and all of you will receive a follow-up link. And of course, the other way that you can see some of this stuff is in our forums, forums.mertechdata.com, where we talk about evolution stuff, and where we're gonna, you know, we'll have all of our links to our YouTube videos in there as well. And if you have any questions of Aaron, he'll be in there as well, and you're welcome to ask any follow-up questions. I know sometimes as soon as we end it, you end up with some questions, so feel free to go into our forums. If you don't have an invite right now on that, you know, you can just go onto our website and request that, and certainly we'll get you invited there. And if you've joined the webinar today and haven't been invited, we'll go through and make that available there. As for updates to evolution, there was an update posted about a week and a half ago. There will be another update to evolution coming in approximately by the end of this month, so we may need another week or two before that's ready. We'll certainly keep you up to date on that. Riaz posted into the forums some of the features that are coming in the next version. We'll have the full SOAP support in there. We'll have a beta of the deployment install as well. And maybe, Aaron, you can pull up the forums in your browser there.
Sure.
Just go to forums.mertechdata.com. Okay. Let me get you in there. Right now the forums are invitation only. I think Aaron's in there, but Aaron, why don't you hand control over to me real quick, and I'll show him what it looks like. So, you know, our forums, let me get my screen set up here. Here we go. Our forums here have discussions related to Evolution. The new beta versions of Evolution are going to be posted here. And as you can see here, our latest version was posted a couple of weeks ago. And of course, we're working on another update. Riaz mentioned here, our next update is going to have some cosmetic improvements. The SOAP support will have a better testing framework as well. And of course, the deployment beta will be available very shortly, where you can actually try out a full deployable install of Evolution on a server environment. So that's in the works as well. So we hope to see you all in here. Like I said, if you don't have an invite, we'll get you on there very shortly.